Across the street is a 450 Sutter. It's both the street address but also the official name of the building. I'm fond of Art Deco, and it's a beautiful example of Art Deco. On the west coast of the United States from about 1900 to 1930, there was a movement in design work, particularly in architecture, for using Mesoamerican design. In the gold work we see what looks like a winged tree. And that winged tree is the Sephrot, which in Jewish mystical thought is the tree of life, representing the different degrees of reunification with God and a return to harmony of civilization. The building, the reason that's there is what was here up until 1926 was the Temple Emmanuel, the first synagogue west of the Mississippi River in the United States, stood on this site from 1861 through 1927. During the 1906 earthquake, the two towers were collapsed because of the earthquake. They were rebuilt, but by the 1920s, the congregation was concerned that in the event of another earthquake, the two towers were not more than the two towers, maybe the whole building would collapse. So they decided to sell them, not only the building to tear it down, but to sell the location. And now Temple Emmanuel is about 2 miles due west from where we are. So a member of the congregation, who was a developer, bought the site from his own congregation and put up this building to serve the dental office needs of San Francisco. So 20% of all the dentists in the city are here. That's one story, and an interesting one indeed about the architecture and the building itself. But now something about the culture represented by the Sephrot, the Jewish culture. So the world's first social movement story, the first time a piece of literature talked about liberation for not just one person escaping, but for society, is the Exodus story, the story of Moses taking the Hebrew people out of Egypt, out of slavery, to a promised land. That's the first time in literature there's this idea that human beings have a natural right to be free and be dignified. Because here's a story written about an enslaved people who have a right not to be enslaved. Never before had this been in the civilized world, been a notion that was articulated, which was, namely, slavery's wrong. It's simply not the proper state for any human being to be in. The word Hebrew, incidentally, means outsider. It means outcast. It means the people who are outside of society. So it's likely to have been a word adopted by the Hebrews themselves from the people who called them that, the people that they went to live with. And the people they went to live with were civilized. The word civilized simply means to be in a city. That's literally what the word civil means, is city. And the Hebrews themselves were a nomadic people who traveled from place to place. They had no sense of ownership of land. But in that time in the Middle East, the typical notion was that there was a God associated with each place, each piece of land, including each city. And the cultures which the Hebrews, the civilized cultures which the Hebrews encountered when they moved to what we now call Palestine, Israel, were very hierarchical, very vertical in social structure. There was a god of that land, and conveniently the king would say, I'm related to that god, and therefore I have a right to be the owner of this land, and I can hand it out or sell it or give it to whomever I want to. But it's a very vertical structure. The Hebrews were a very horizontal structure, being nomadic. They had no sense of land ownership, and they had no sense of a supreme leader. They had chieftains and kings. In any event, what the Hebrew Bible, that's the so-called Old Testament, is this really interesting social history of, is a study of a division within the Hebrew culture between that portion of the population that wanted to become vertical. They wanted to become landowners. They wanted to join that civilized life, and the culture, the half of the population that said, no, we want to retain our horizontal social structure. Interestingly, it was the more rustic side of the population, the nomadic side, that did the writing, not the civilized side of the population. And that's what comes down to us, is this story of contest, of a battle, literally a battle between the landowning class and the non-landowning class within the Hebrew culture. In any event, there were a loose association of different tribes of people who came to call themselves the Hebrews, and only one of those survived a major set of exiles that occurred. Two enormous empires entered what we now call Israel, Palestine, and took away almost all the population. 100 years later, one group, the tribe of Judah, returns, and that's where we get the word Jew, is from this one tribe of the many tribes of Israel that managed to survive and be restored to the land. What was peculiar about the Hebrews and their God, Yahweh, Jehovah, was that their God traveled with them. Other gods were situated because of the land where they were. They represented that land. The Hebrew God traveled with them. And it is thought that this is where this idea of a universal God with the Hebrews comes from, is from a God that actually literally travels. And in this division, this battle between the Hebrews that want to go vertical and the Hebrews that want to stay horizontal in social structure, that God, Yahweh, becomes associated with justice. In their minds, they begin arguing, they make a connection and say, God wants justice. And so their God becomes not just a God of place, but a God of purpose. And the idea of there being a purpose to the human being really originates with the Jews. They're the first folks to say every human being has a purpose in life, and that purpose is to become aligned with God. And it's to do justice. And what does justice look like? It looks like the following 5 bits. First, do you like the weekend? Where does the weekend come from? It comes from the Jews. Thank you. It comes from the Sabbath. The idea of having an end of the week, which itself is an original idea of the Jews. The Jews originate the idea of dividing time into a 7-day week and having a day off, that's the weekend, the Sabbath, originates again with the Hebrews. So the idea that because there's a bit of the divine being created by God in every living thing deserves rest. This is, again, what a great notion for a social justice movement. Have some time off. Secondly, the word Sabbath actually means 7. And in the ancient world, oftentimes when a new king would come to power, that king would forgive all debt. Why would a king forgive all debt? So they'd be well liked. Forgive all debt. No one owes me anything. Thank you. The debt would recover itself over time. People would become indebted again. The Hebrews were unique in the ancient world in advocating that every 7 years there was to be debt forgiveness. It was made periodic, and it was divorced as an idea, as a concept, that is, debt forgiveness was divorced from the king. It became a God-given right rather than a king-given right. It was made an absolute. So this idea of debt forgiveness is, I think, ought to be a central aspect of any social movement. How do you get out from underneath owing perpetually, perhaps, a debt to another? Thirdly, ancient Israel had a social security system. What did it look like? It was not a money payment. It was this. In the farming pieces of land, the owner of that land was forbidden to harvest 12 feet, about approximately 12 feet, 4 meters of the perimeter of the land, and that crop was left specifically to the homeless, the widow, and the orphan. That was their social security system. And the reasoning was simply this: God enabled that grain to come up. And because God gave it to the world, you can't own all of it. You've got to share it with those who are needy. Again, that was their social security program. Fourth element of, I think, wonderful social movement, justice, temperament that ought to be kept in mind and modeled first by the Hebrews was the idea of no tax on work. There was no equivalent of an income tax. So how did ancient Israel raise revenue to pay for streets and walls and things that cities at that time had? They didn't have the elaborate social structure we have today, a transportation system, but how did they pay for that? In ancient Israel, it was paid for by a 10% tax on the average productivity of the land. And the key word there is average. That is, if one piece of land was capable of producing, say, 10 bushels of wheat on average, you had to pay 1 bushel to what we would recognize as the government, 10%. If you were able to produce 12 bushels on 10 bushel land, you got to keep the extra 2 bushels untaxed. It was 10% of the average productivity. If you produced 7 bushels on 10 bushel land, you still had to pay 1 bushel. Because here's the important piece. The Hebrews connected God with land and argued that the productivity in a sense of God was the productivity of the land. And that's why you owed a certain percentage to the community was of its average productivity. And then lastly, and for the Americans here, this may be the most startling little story to learn, is the Jubilee. The word actually comes from Hebrew, and it means to shout. Every 50 years, every Hebrew family was expected to return to its original apportionment of land. According to the Hebrew Bible, when the Hebrews entered the place now known as Israel-Palestine, they divided the land up in such a way that every family had enough land to feed itself. If land was near water, it was a smaller piece of land because it was more productive. If it was on a hillside, you got more land because you needed more land because you needed irrigation and you didn't have it, so you needed more land to produce as much food. Because God had made the land, there could be no private land ownership. Only God could own it. Each family was given by God enough land to use, but you couldn't rent it out in any ordinary sense. You could not sell it. All you could do was leave it for a while if you wished to, and then every 50 years at the Jubilee, your family was restored. The importance of this economically is that every Hebrew family was economically independent. They were not dependent upon working for somebody in order to feed themselves. I can't emphasize that enough. If you can meet all your material needs, even at a minimal level, but if you can meet your animal needs, you don't need to go to work for anyone. And that is precisely what the Hebrew constitution, called the Torah, the law, created. It created a circumstance by which everyone was economically independent. Are you familiar with the Liberty Bell? It's a big bell. It's in Philadelphia. It has this crack in it. And if I were to ask you why it's called the Liberty Bell, you would say it has to do with the Constitution and the American Revolution. That's not why it's called the Liberty Bell. It's called the Liberty Bell because molded into the top of the bell is a quote from the Hebrew Bible that reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof." The word liberty does not mean freedom to put dark glasses on or take them off whenever you wish to. It actually means debt forgiveness. A better translation would be proclaim debt forgiveness throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof. Well, imagine what that would do to America. The Wells Fargo no longer owns its mortgages. That's what this is actually saying. It's destroying that debt power. That's how powerful I'm suggesting this Hebrew story is, because it's part of the American culture. We see it, but we don't see it. It's like the cat. We see it, but we don't see it.